let's get started. Alright, so welcome to class. Today's lesson is called The Ashes of World War I. So, can anyone first of all tell me what's going on in this picture? Who's that in the middle? That's Hitler, yeah. And these swastikas, what do they represent? Nazi party, right? Yeah. This is Hitler at one of his famous rallies. I think the Nuremberg rallies, yeah. So it's representing the Nazi party. So obviously when we talk about what rises from the actions of World War I, Adolf Hitler, the Nazi party, and the Second World War is the obvious answer. But we're going to talk about how they are just one of several consequences of this war. Now I think the first little step that we need to take in talking about the consequences of the war is simply looking at the human consequences. Like, this war is completely devastating. Like, there are about 16 million killed, and you know, that'd be a lot today, even by today's standards. But at the time, there were like fewer than 2 billion people in the world, as opposed to more than 7 billion now. It's an even greater percentage of the world's population that suffered, which makes it like particularly brutal. So just looking at like the Wikipedia article on World War I casualties, it says something like 15 to 22 million deaths and 23 million wounded. I mean, that's insane. It's by far the most of any war in history up to that point. And the tragic thing is that those figures only get eclipsed by the Second World War a couple of decades later. You scroll through like the individual countries, how each one suffered. You know, Britain here, we've got what, close to 1 million civilian, like close to 1 million soldiers died. France, we have 1.15 million died. United States, not as many because they weren't in the war for as long, but still 116,000. That's about twice as many as in the Vietnam War, in 10 times less time. And of course, you know, when we look at the Central Powers, those are especially severe. You know, more than 2 million for Germany, like 300,000 for the Ottoman Empire, and of course Austro-Hungary, since they were the ones who started it and were center to it, something like 1.2 million casualties. It's insane, right? And sorry, get this full screen again. Okay, so many there are many memorials and cemeteries to this day that speak to its impact. I talked about how, you know, you go to DC now and see the National War Memorial. You go to Kansas City, see the National War Museum, and that's in the United States. In Europe, because they were especially hard hit by this, the impact and devastation was so great, and thus the number of memorials and cemeteries are even more numerous. So I think I told you I spent a year in France once. I spent a lot of time, like, you know, popping around different cities or small towns in the suburbs of Paris. Every single one of them, invariably, if you go to their cemeteries, has something that looks like this: a list of all the young men of the town who died in the war, statues, you know, representing French soldiers in their military outfits and such, and then this message that says, you know, the children of our town who died for France, mort pour la France in French. Again, it ties to it does speak, I think, to the nationalism of the era. They still want this idea that these men died in France, died for their country, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. The idea that it's good to die for your country, which obviously gets dispelled by the war's end, but it's still very, very strong at the war's beginning. In 2014-15, I was living in like a 3,000 person town in the French suburbs called Étiole, and their memorial to World War I had 20 names. So 20 young men in a town of 3,000 perished. And one town over, Soissy-sur-Seine, had 50 men perish. And that's just like small towns with a few thousand people. If you go to like the big cities like Paris, you can see tens and tens of thousands of names on cemeteries around town. That really brought to life to me just how terrible these consequences were, right? The fact that every single town, no matter how small, has a group of, has a list of young men who died, and number in the dozens. or hundreds, or even more. It's if you think about the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., which has the names of 60,000 men, Americans who died in the Vietnam War. Imagine taking 20 of those walls, breaking them up in little pieces, and sprinkling them around France. That's what it's like there. That's how it is when you go from cemetery to cemetery and see all those names. If you did all of them, there would be more than a million because of how badly hit France was by this war. And obviously that's just one of several countries that suffered this grisly fate. So now we're going to look, I guess first of all, on the topic of France, like here are some more of my pictures from France. So I mentioned in the other class that if you go to northeastern France, you can see the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. This is the largest American cemetery in Europe. Many of the Americans who died in this combat in this war are buried right here. So just a massive collection of marble cemeteries, tombstones rather, in one cemetery. If we go, this famous Arc de Triomphe in Paris, on the inside you can see, a statue of World War I infantryman, similar to this one here in the suburbs. And if you go to the outside, you can see this famous tomb. Does anyone happen to know the name of this tomb? It's the tomb of what kind of soldier? Fill in the adjective. What do we have here? The tomb of the blank soldier. Any ideas?
It's range what you hear.
You probably have heard this term. This is the tomb of the blank. What kind of soldier in Paris?
We need to use dog tags.
Rocket.
Okay. What happens if you don't have your dog tags?
Nameless, right?
What's another name for nameless?
Nameless or
It
anonymous.
starts with
Undefined, close. Unidentified, close. Unidentified is close. Any ideas?
It starts with the letter K.
Okay. Unknown, very good. You guys have heard this term, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier? Perhaps. Perhaps you've come across it, yeah. Anyway, so I believe that the original Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was this one here at the base of the Arc de Triomphe, which in French. And like I took these two pictures, by the way, when I visited Paris last year. And it says in French, like, here lies an unknown soldier who died in France between 1914 and 1918. So that means all of the soldiers who were unidentified or went missing in action are all represented by this solid flame at the base of Arc de Triomphe. The Arc de Triomphe was like built for Napoleon and his army, so it was meant to symbolize like French military power. So after World War I, that was just like an indelible, unavoidable chapter of French military history that needed to be identified. So they did it at the symbol of the French military, which is this giant archway in Paris. And yeah, it's just an eternal flame. It's perpetually fed oil. So they keep it burning to represent how the memory of those who lost in this war should be eternal. And the idea really caught on. There's now a good number of Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers around the world and in the U.S. Where do you think the most famous one is? What cemetery? It is. That's with an A. In the D.C. suburbs.
Senators are sometimes buried there. Soldiers are sometimes buried there.
John Kennedy's buried there. Any idea? Guys, you know? Where's his name? That's with an A. You know the name of the cemetery? It's Arlington National Cemetery.
Quick question, Mr. Governor.
Yes.
That picture up top in the middle.
Yep.
You said it's the largest American cemetery in France.
Yeah, I think all of
that
it.
is common for soldiers who lose their life to be sent home.
Oftentimes, yes, they're sent home, but in the case of World War I and II, a lot were still just buried on French soil. So,
Was it because there's too many to send back?
basically, they maybe just too many, because obviously this was a long time ago before transporting bodies intact could be done the way it is today, and also France was willing to donate a bit of land, sort of as a thank you for your help and motivation. And so I think this cemetery, as well as the American Cemetery in Normandy, right by the Canadian beaches, is just a gift from France to the U.S. It's tax free, and it's a big thank you gift, basically. All right. So guys, if we look up like tomb, the Ultimate Soldier, I mean, yeah, you can see when I put that into the search bar on Wikipedia that a lot pop up, but the most famous one in the U.S. is this one here at Arlington National Cemetery. So it's just like perpetually, it's just like kind of like the one in France. It's just like perpetually monitored. It's constantly got infantrymen in there, and you can go pay your respects, play a wreath. And the idea for this famous one here in the States really what did take after the one in Paris that I showed you in the presentation, which was a way to like memorialize the First World War. Okay, and so just I wanted to address like the human consequences and lives lost in World War I first of all, because that's obviously very important to keep that memory alive. But it's also I think important to think about the more long-term impacts of World War I. So obviously the immediate impact is that more 10, 15 million plus people have died, and we have a world largely left in ruins. The story about what happened next, though, is also important to tell. So we're going to be looking at that in the next few slides. I'll start with showing this video.
After 4 years of fighting in World War I, millions had lost their lives and the world was forever changed. Hi, I'm Rebecca Braden, welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be taking a look at the aftermath of the First World War. Undeniably, the greatest consequence of the First World War was the massive loss of life. France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers and an additional 300,000 civilians in the war. More than 1.8 million Russian soldiers were killed, as well as 1.5 million civilians. In total, World War I was responsible for the deaths of over 16 million people. However, numbers relating to the death toll are still debated. Considered separate but still related to World War I was the effect the flu pandemic of 1918 had on the world. First seen in North America, it is suspected the flu was brought to Europe by the American forces. This flu was ultimately responsible for the deaths of nearly 50 million people worldwide. Many countries on both sides felt the severe economic consequences of waging a world war. The United Kingdom went from one of the world's largest overseas investors to one of its biggest debtors. Less concrete changes for Britain were also apparent. There was a surge in national pride among some of the Commonwealth nations. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand held important roles in numerous battles throughout the war. Subsequently, they received more diplomatic autonomy in the decade that followed. Returning home from the battlefields, soldiers across...
So yeah, I mean, obviously World War II is famous for like bringing about the end of colonialism. A lot of African countries, for instance, go free not long after World War II. But also it's important to know that World War I had that effect in its own right. We saw Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, as the video just mentioned, get more political autonomy. Basically, again, kind of as a thank you present for their contributions to the war effort.
Across the world were greeted with a different social landscape. Women who filled the gap in jobs left by the men serving
Talk about this, remember?
Motivated to help their country, many women worked distributing coal or making ammunition, and also provided a large amount of voluntary work. These new roles helped to change the social status and working lives of women even after World War I had ended. Political lines were redrawn in the aftermath of the war. Once powerful German, Russian, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires were dissolved, with the latter two ceasing to exist altogether. Large parts of the former empires were now split up into new countries like Finland, Turkey, and Czechoslovakia. Most importantly for the future of Europe and the world was what was happening in Germany, a A parliamentary system called the Weimar Republic replaced the imperial form of government in 1919. However, the new government was riddled with issues. They were forced to deal with hyperinflation, hostility from other countries, and political extremists within their own country. Many in Germany were still resentful over the Treaty of Versailles, which had forced the country to accept sole responsibility in causing the First World War. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party used these strong emotions to their advantage, and Hitler climbed to the position of Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Very quickly, Hitler established a totalitarian regime called the Third Reich and put an end to the Weimar Republic after only 14 years. Only 20 years after the end of World War I, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and the century's Second World War was underway.
Alright. So, good video. I like this channel, Watch Mojo. Now that the last point you made about how 20 years after World War I and another World War II ensued, that's really what we want to look at when we're talking about the long-term consequences of World War I. The fact that before you know it, these two men and other scoundrels are in power. So you guys, as you guys know and pointed out, that's Adolf Hitler, very famous, famous icon. A lot of famous features of him, his hat, his uniform, his mustache, and of course the Nazi swastika.
Aren't they like the World War II though?
Yeah, they are World War II. That's what we're looking at now, like how
Oh,
World
we're
War
on
I
World War II now.
kind of morphed into World War II. Yeah, because remember today's unit lesson is from the ashes of World War I. So the impact. So first of all, we're left. The war leaves 50+ million people dead. Second of all, it doesn't really solve problems or bring peace. It really sets the stage for the Second World War. It's, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, some of the worst bad guys in history, especially modern history, all emerged with little atmosphere poisoned by the First World War. So that's what's really important to remember. All right, so needless to say, if your country gets destroyed, if you're left in shambles and you don't get a chance to speak up for yourself, which is what happened with the Versailles Treaty and all, obviously you're going to be upset and want payback in some form. And Hitler, I think, especially recognizes that fact, embodies that. It's because his vision, his Nazi party, his swift militarization of Germany are all a consequence of that vision. The idea that we need to build a better Germany, one that's positioned to retaliate for the injustice of the First World War. So Hitler believes that. Stalin, with his Soviet Union, also believes that. We need to build ourselves back up, reindustrialize, after having been so badly devastated by World War I. And Mussolini, you guys might know this guy, Benito Mussolini. He's the leader of Italy, of fascist Italy, and I think he's not quite as vilified as Hitler and Stalin in history, basically because he didn't carry out mass genocide or mass political terror the way Hitler and Stalin did, but obviously he still deserves to be condemned because of his contributions to World War II for the Axis powers. Yeah, so obviously, when we think about the impact of World War I, knowing that set the stage for another World War is what's most important. And here's another video I'm going to share with you guys that elaborates on that. It's by documenting Hitler's rise to power.
How did Adolf Hitler, a tyrant who orchestrated one of the largest genocides in human history, rise to power in a democratic country? The story begins at the end of World War I. With the successful Allied advance in 1918, Germany realized the war was unwinnable and signed an armistice ending the fighting. As its imperial government collapsed,
as we watch, please think about, as we go into the videos, think about what points seem most important, what new bits of information really stand out to you, and I'd love to hear from you guys at the end of this video how it kind of moved you the most. I would love to just take a couple responses from you all, so just be mindful of that.
civil unrest and worker strikes spread across the nation. Fearing the communist revolution, major parties joined to suppress the uprisings, establishing the parliamentary Weimar Republic. One of the new government's first tasks tenth of its territory and dismantling its army, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war and pay reparations, debilitating its already weakened economy. All this was seen as a humiliation by many nationalists and veterans. They wrongly believed the war could have been won if the army hadn't been betrayed by politicians and protesters. For Hitler, these views became obsession, and his bigotry and paranoid delusions led him to pin the blame on Jews. His words found resonance in a society with many anti-Semitic people. By this time, hundreds of thousands of Jews had integrated into German society, but many Germans continued to perceive them as outsiders. After World War I, Jewish success led to ungrounded accusations of subversion and war profiteering. It cannot be stressed enough that these conspiracy theories were born out of fear, anger, and bigotry, not fact. Nonetheless, Hitler found success with them. When he joined a small nationalist political party, his manipulative public speaking launched him into its leadership and drew increasingly larger crowds. Combining anti-Semitism with populist resentment, the Nazis denounced both communism and capitalism as international Jewish conspiracies to destroy Germany. The Nazi Party was not initially popular. After they made an unsuccessful attempt at overthrowing the government, the party was banned, and Hitler jailed for treason.
That incident is what's called the Beer Hall Push. It's not his initial attempt to seize power in like 1924, 25 or so on. It takes place in Munich, Germany. You can still go there today and see the beer hall where it took place. You got a question?
And I'm like, why do they blame the Jewish people for like losing the war?
Yeah, right. That is a really good question, and like honestly, it's really hard to answer because it should seem ridiculous that they would do that. Like, what on earth do the Jewish people have to do with like them on their own free will deciding to invade Belgium and France? Right? Did any Jewish people like trick them in doing so? Of course not. It's nonsense. So obviously this should never have happened. But basically because they need a scapegoat, and because Germany and the rest of Europe has a long, terrible history of anti-Semitism and hatred and repulsion of the Jewish people, once again they become the victim. In other words, we don't want anyone to blame ourselves for what happened, to blame us for what happened, say the German politicians. We want them to be mad at the Jews instead. I mean, they're like angry and don't like the Jews anyway, so they might as well just keep picking on them instead of trying to attack us. You know, they're the easiest target, basically. You know, it's a very sad story, and obviously has a lot of terrible consequences. But it's the truth, and it's a big lesson of history. You can't, you know, unfairly discriminate against minority groups or any groups because you know the dangers of doing so obviously occurred during this part of history. And the world has had to live with the guilt ever since.
But upon his release about a year later, he immediately began to rebuild the movement. And then in 1929, the Great Depression happened. It led to American banks withdrawing their loans from Germany, and the already struggling German economy collapsed overnight. Hitler took advantage of the people's anger, offering them convenient scapegoats and a promise to restore Germany's
Convenient scapegoats. That's basically it.
Mainstream parties proved unable to handle the crisis, while left-wing opposition was too fragmented by internal squabbles. And so, some of the frustrated public flocked to the Nazis, increasing their parliamentary votes from
That's another thing, frustrated public, right? We see this all throughout history with times of revolution and radical changes in leaderships. We've seen the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, and of course we see it here in the aftermath of World War II. Frustrated public, we want to change, we want something different. Let's go with a radically different guy because we want to go in a radically different direction in our country.
under 3%.
Again, I bring this up because I think when studying history, it's very, very important to look at the patterns that occur, so that we understand like what can set the stage for bad things or good things too to happen over and over again. We can recognize those patterns and learn from them so that we can set the stage for good things to happen and and bad things not to happen, basically.
to over 18% in just 2 years. In 1932, Hitler ran for president, losing the election to decorated war hero General von Hindenburg.
Anyone recognize this building in Berlin? It's called the Reichstag. You can still visit it today. It's basically their parliament building. So it's like the one with Big Ben. In London, it's like their Congress. In DC, I mean, you can tell it's sort of like the U.S. Congress. It's got a dome in the middle and houses with flags on top on both sides. So like the architectural symbolism is there. This Reichstag is really beaten up throughout World War II, especially at the end when the Soviets invade. But it's also largely rebuilt, and you can visit today. It's still, I've been there too. It does make for a very impressive visit, and a great chunk of German political history then and now.
But with 36% of the vote, Hitler had demonstrated the extent of his support. The following year, advisors and business leaders convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as
We
chancellor.
talked about this earlier.
To change.
You know, if Hindenburg had gone with someone else, if he had said, no, I don't think you're qualified, which obviously he wasn't, he had very little political experience, and of course was a dangerous man. If Hindenburg had seen that coming and not appointed him, who knows, it could have been a very different world. But obviously that's not what happened.
And his popularity for their own goals. Though the chancellor was only the administrative head of parliament, Hitler steadily expanded the power of his position. While his supporters formed paramilitary groups and fought protesters in the streets, Hitler raised fears of a communist uprising and argued that only he could restore law and order. Then, in 1933, a young worker was convicted of setting fire to the Parliament building. Hitler used the event to convince the government to grant them emergency powers. Within a matter of months, freedom of the press was abolished, other parties were disbanded, and anti-Jewish laws were passed. Many of Hitler's early radical supporters were arrested and executed, along with potential rivals. And when President Hindenburg died in August 1934, it was clear there would be no new election. Disturbingly, many of Hitler's early measures didn't require mass repression. His speeches exploited people's fear and ire to drive their support behind him and the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, businessmen and intellectuals wanting to be on the right side of public opinion endorsed Hitler. They assured themselves and each other that his more extreme rhetoric was only for show. Decades later, Hitler's rise remains a warning of how fragile democratic institutions can be in the face of angry crowds and a leader willing to feed their anger and exploit their fears.
Alright. I think it's a really good video. Kind of helps explain a lot. What did you guys think was most impressive about it? What kind of messages or facts stood out to you? You know, 1 or 2 examples? Fear mongering, yeah, that's a really good one, right? So definitely have to be mindful of political fear mongering, right? Obviously, fear mongering in other contexts. In this case, we need to be wary of people, politicians who create false fears, exaggerated claims, right? Oh, there's a communist threat going in the east. Oh, the Jewish people are out to get us. They stabbed us in the back and chairs in the First World War. We can't let them do it again. All kinds of, you know, luckily now we look back and say all kinds of complete nonsense. And now the world knows better. But obviously at the time, the Nazis were able to get away with making messages like that. Anyone else? Anything you like about like, the style of the video? Like the animation, the graphics and such? Yeah? What do you like about it?
The transitions very well done.
Uh-huh.
And the illustrations have been soft or stylistically
Yeah, no, I agree with that. We're just lucky we live in an age now where technology and artistry can be employed and make important historical messages succinct and very catchy, right? So in other words, we can, thanks to videos like this, we can, consume history, consume lessons of history in 5 minutes on YouTube. I think that's really, really great. All right, and so obviously, as you guys know, before too long, there's another World War, and talking about World War II is a whole other unit that would take just as long as and probably even longer actually, because it was a longer and more destructive war to teach you guys. So we won't go into it too much, but I think it is important, as I said earlier, to identify some of the patterns of history, and there are plenty of patterns that we can identify between World War I and World War II. They can help us really understand how one war kind of morphed into the other. So likewise, in World War I, Germany has ideas of expanding, gaining more territory for its people, and plots unprovoked invasions of its neighboring countries. We saw that in World War I, we see it again in World War II. One of the limits now is that Germany starts off by going east and invading Poland, as opposed to going west and invading Belgium. But what do you know? Before too long, they invade Belgium and France as well. And as we've talked about earlier, there's a ton of military technology that emerges in World War I. So aircraft, tanks, machine guns, poison gas, all kinds of stuff. And we see all of those, except poison gas, I think, because that's quickly banned by international law. But we see airplanes, tanks, machine guns, all kinds of artillery that was kind of tested in World War I, now coming back in an even greater extent in the Second World War. So I mentioned how tanks are first used for the first time on the Western Front in World War I. Sure enough, they get used and are even more perfected and intelligent in World War II. And as you guys know, I like sharing my pictures. Here's one of me in Belgium last year, visiting a World War II museum with all these impressive World War II tanks behind me, just to give you a sense of how important tanks were by the time the Second World War came along. So they started off in World War I, and 20 years later, they're even better, even stronger in World War II. Then that makes a huge difference, both for the Germans early in the war and for the Allies later on, when the tide shifts more in their favor. I mean, again, we see, nationalism, the sense of national entitlement. Our country deserves better. That message is important in World War I. It's also important in World War II. We see propaganda of all kinds, promoting the country, demonizing the opponent, emerge in both World War I and II. We see notions of imperialism. Oh, we want our empire, we want to have a certain empire. That kind of thinking emerges in World War I. It definitely occurs in World War II. Reich actually means empire in German, so Nazis were talking about themselves as like the Third Reich, the new German empire. Italy also, Mussolini talked about having a new Roman Empire for Italy, and the idea didn't catch on in Italy as much as it did in Germany, but obviously it's still pretty consequential. And once again, we see the U.S. initially stay neutral, initially say this isn't our war, it's not happening on our soil, and thus, once again, they don't enter the war right away, but also, once again, we see that change when they become the victim of an unprovoked attack. In World War I, it was Lusitania and other ships, and obviously in World War II, it's Pearl Harbor. And then also, we see the war conclude when the initial opponent, Germany, becomes, and their companions become exhausted, they just run out of many resources and collapse. So we see that happen in World War I in 1918. We see it again happen to Germany in 1945. And this time around, the consequences were much, much more severe for Germany. So remember yesterday I talked about how they were planning to invade, but didn't. At the end of World War I, in World War II, they straight up invaded. And the images of shell-shocked German cities, especially Dresden and Berlin, still are very haunting to this day. So that's all I'll say for that. And now comes time for a little class exercise in about 15 minutes. So, Mr. Cooper kindly printed off a list of the consequences of World War I. Oh yeah, once again, that's me chilling with the French guy dressed as a French soldier at the World War Memorial in DC back in 2018. on November 11th, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. It was obviously a day that made a big impact on me because I shared a lot of pictures with you guys. But it's true. It was really great then. It's still great now to go and take advantage of living history and still do commemorations if you get the chance. Anyway, so here's a list of the effects of World War I. Obviously, there's very many, but I think these are the essential ones. You can, if everyone wants, you guys, yeah. So you're all going to get a copy. Hey guys, it's up.
How many are on the list? Did you count them? Take a quick count, Mark.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. There's 12 total. Alright, so every table gets
So everything on that list is in that envelope, just cut out.
oh wait.
Three of them total.
Some of them are from the last class though, so there's
Oh.
I'm sure I otherwise I'll be confused. I don't want that. Alright, so what I want you to do now is go through, you read through this list of the main consequences of World War I, and I want you to read through the list, go over it with your classmates, and talk about which ones you think are the most severe and which ones from which you think might not top the list, but they're still important, but it's up to you to decide which ones are especially important, especially devastating. So you have now, what time is it? You have now about 10 minutes, so spend some time reading, discussing, and making your ranking, right? And at the very end of the class, we'll go over which ones you think were the most consequential. Basically why you ranked them the way you did. Everyone understand? Everyone understand?
You got it, Janessa?
Okay, let me know if you have questions, and good luck, guys.
There's a timer on there.
Oh, yeah.
I would set it for like 9.5 minutes. That's cool.
Okay.
On silver.
Okay. Alright, guys, good luck. Alright, see everyone reading, going over the list, then spend some time talking about it with your classmates at your table, and then we'll discuss. Okay, that's a solid,
Some silver. Would you make